I love never seen this one. I love seeing all the words. I've never seen it.
Okay, we're on page 130, right? Correct?
Yes.
Great. See how well this thing works. Cool. So now we've done acid bases. We've taken care of the renal system, the GI tract, the nervous system, cardiovascular. Am I forgetting any? I don't think so. And what do we start everything off with? Do you remember what the first one we talked about before the cell even? The whole theme of the entire book is revolving around what process in the body? Homeostasis. So now we're going to talk about this again. And there was a special kind of loop that I told you really want to associate with homeostasis. And what's it called? Negative feedback loops. So what's the opposite of a negative feedback loop? Positive, right? Kind of makes sense. So we're going to spend a lot of time over the next week and a half, roughly, talking about feedback loops. So just as a refresher, the two systems of the body that run all the other system, what's the number one, most important one? Of course, nervous system. So nervous system, remember, it's fast, is extremely well organized, very precise. When it sends a signal to somewhere, it sends it exactly to that place. What's the name of that connection between the nervous system and a muscle or gland or another neuron? The synapse. It's very specific. We're talking about nanometers, so millionths of a meter in distance. When it sends a signal from one structure to another one, it's extremely tightly controlled. Extremely. So very well organized, very fast. And then what, of course, is the other system? Nervous system and the endocrine system. And what do you know, speed-wise, compared to the nervous system, what's the endocrine system? Very slow. Instead of sending things a nanometer apart, how far does it send it? All the way from the top of the head to the bottom of the toes and back. How does it send its signals? Through the blood. So it just dumps things into the bloodstream and counts on the bloodstream carrying everything around. When we look at the endocrine system, it's not nearly as organized as the nervous system. The nervous system, like I said, is very precise. When you look at the endocrine system, it has organs all over the place. And a lot of the organs that we're going to talk about with the endocrine system you've already heard of before, like the kidneys. You already know one hormone, actually two hormones that you should know right now. They're released by the kidney. What are they? Renin should be burned into your brain after the last month. What's the other one? We talked about it when we talked about blood. Let's sneeze. Erythropoietin, right. So the kidneys release hormones. Renin, erythropoietin are two of the hormones you need to be familiar with. And all through the semester I told you if you saw a hormone, you need to write it down. Okay. So we're going to talk about some specialized endocrine organs too, like the thyroid gland, the pituitary gland. Did the heart release any hormones? The heart's not on this picture.
Yes.
What's the name of the hormone? ANP. And like I said, most of the glands in the body, or most of the organs in the body, you're going to find release some kind of a hormone. Even the skin. What's a hormone that the skin makes when it's exposed to sunlight? Vitamin D. Vitamin D is actually a hormone because how does it travel? In the blood. It gets dumped into the blood and it travels throughout the blood. So don't be confused by the names. And the first week of class, I even told you when you compare the nervous system to the endocrine system, you want to think of it like in an emergency situation. I'm driving down the road, somebody comes really close to me and starts to cut me off. I see them, I respond quickly by pulling to the side of the road, I apply the brakes, I slow down, come to a stop and wave goodbye with at least one finger. And then, right, that's really quick. But if I wait like 10 or 15 seconds, how do I start feeling? My hands start jittering, I'm shaky, I feel really anxious. Why? What's the name of the chemical that started traveling through my blood? Adrenaline, right? So epinephrine. What's the name of the chemical that controlled my sympathetic nervous system to make me feel or get that fast response? Same thing. It's exactly the same. So make sure you know the main characteristics of each of the systems. How fast they work, how tightly they're organized, what the name of the transmitter is or the chemical signal carrier is. What is the chemical signal carrier for the nervous system? A what transmitter? Neurotransmitter. And then, of course, the chemical signal for the endocrine is the hormone. Right. When you're looking at the endocrine system, there's a special system that revolves around the endocrine. And it's all about locking key mechanisms. It's kind of precise in the fact that you have to have a lock for whatever key you release. So the hormone's a key. The lock would be called a what? That receives the chemical. A receptor. So if I want some cell to respond to a hormone, it has to have a what on the surface of it? Or on it, in it. It has to have a receptor. It has to. So if I dump a chemical in my blood, it goes all over my body. It can hit lots and lots of cells, but it doesn't affect those cells unless it has a receptor. So whatever that cell that has a receptor is, it's called a target tissue. So you can think of it this way. The hormone's the key, the target tissue is the door that you're trying to find, and the receptor is the lock in the door. And they even refer to it as a lock and key interaction. And you'll find that some hormones actually trigger more than one type of lock. It's like having a regular key that you have, and then if you're renting from someone and they have a master key, they'll open all of the locks that they have. So it's the same kind of idea. We'll talk about some different chemicals that can trigger each other. In fact, we already talked about that, norepinephrine and epinephrine. What are the two types of receptors in general that I told you to remember with epinephrine and norepinephrine? One has a symbol that looks like a fish. Alpha and beta, right? The alpha and beta receptors. And we talked about how two different neurotransmitters can actually affect those. So it's one lock, but two different keys for it. And we've talked about this before. If it's a nervous system releasing something, it's called a neurotransmitter. However, if it's a neuron releasing it into the blood, now it's actually technically a what? A hormone. So we call it a neurohormone. And I've just given you a perfect example of a neurohormone, something that can be used as a neurotransmitter, but if it's dumped in the blood, it becomes a hormone. What's that? I gave this situation with my car. I'm afraid, and I pull this side of the road. Yeah, adrenaline, so epinephrine. So epinephrine, norepinephrine is a perfect example of something that can be a hormone or a neurotransmitter. Okay, so this screen is just terrible today, but which is a true statement about the endocrine system? How about number 1, true or false? False. That's the nervous system, right? How about number 2? The messenger travels in the blood.
True.
Yep, that's true. So when it says the endocrine system controls or regulates aspects quickly, what can we do to change that to make it real?
Slowly.
We could put slowly or change it to the nervous system, exactly. And the endocrine system is anatomically well organized. Very false. It's scattered everywhere. It's all over the place. The brain, the throat, it's in the chest, it's all the way down in the genitals, it's all over the place. Good job, everybody. All right, the next several pages are keys that you have to remember. When we start talking about individual hormones, I'm going to keep coming back to these keys over and over and over and over again. The important thing about the endocrine system is if you learn these special keys now, when you get into pharmacology or take any kind of pharmacology-like class, all of the rules that we're about to talk about with hormones apply exactly the same to drugs. So when we talk about what type of hormone it is it lipid-loving or water-loving? Drugs have the same properties. If we say that a hormone has to bind to a receptor, a drug has to bind to a receptor also. So these are really important keys you want to spend some time making sure you know. The first, trophic or non-trophic. Trophic, the word trophic means to nurture, or trophic means to nurture. So if it's a trophic hormone, it's nurturing something and trying to release a second hormone. And that's the key. It's like a mothering hormone. It goes over to a target cell, it nurtures that target cell, and makes it dump out a second hormone. So its primary function is to release a second hormone. When we talk about the hypothalamus, most of the hormones that come from the hypothalamus are going to be trophic hormones. Because they release from the hypothalamus, they go to the pituitary gland, and they make the pituitary gland release a totally new hormone. In fact, a lot of the hormones coming from the pituitary gland will be trophic too. They go down to other organs, like you'll have a hormone coming from the pituitary gland that goes to the adrenal gland. It makes the adrenal gland release cortisol, another hormone. That would be a trophic hormone. The non-trophic hormone doesn't cause that release. The non-trophic does something physiological. In other words, it makes you have some physiological response, like turns up your metabolism. It can make you jittery, like epinephrine. So epinephrine would be a good example of a non-trophic hormone. It goes to its target cells and does something, increases the metabolism, increases the excitability of the target. Testosterone would be another good one. Testosterone goes to the muscles and causes the muscles to increase their protein synthesis. They get bigger in size. It moves next door in the testis and causes the testis to produce sperm. It's a physiological response. It's something we can actually measure or see. Trophic just releases a second hormone. When you see, I don't know, is this in your notes, this picture? Nope, it will be, but not yet. So you might want to draw this little graph. In fact, in the lab today and this week, we're going to be making lots of these little graphs. But I always do this. When I was studying for the endocrine system, everybody said, oh my gosh, it's so terrible and so horrible because you have to memorize so much stuff. And at first it was a lot of memorization, but in reality, if you just understand how it works, it makes it cake. So anytime I put a box around something, it represents an organ. So the hypothalamus is an organ. Where's it located? Yep, in the brain. So it's in the head. And the anterior pituitary, another organ. It's located in the, also in the brain, in the head. And then the thyroid gland, where's that located?
Neck.
In the throat, yeah, the neck. Right. So when I put something in a box, it represents an organ. The arrows represent the blood flow. So the hypothalamus releases something, goes into the blood, and that name of that something is called TRH. So these little, I can't even see it on the screen at all. Is that right? Yeah. So the TRH is the name of the hormone. Bless you. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, which you don't have to write down now. It'll be in your notes later. It goes to the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary releases another hormone called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Take a guess at what it does. Stimulates the thyroid. A lot of the hormones tell you actually what they do. Right? The thyroid stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid and causes it to release T3 and T4. T3 and T4 increase your metabolism. So can you measure an increase in metabolism? What would be a physical symptom of somebody that has high metabolism? They're going to be skinny, right? So it's something you can actually see, the result. They might be a little anxious, a little jittery. What would happen to their body temperature? It would be hotter. Yeah, if you raise their metabolism, it increases their burning calories, so they get hotter. So of TSH and T3, T4, which of these is a trophic hormone? TSH, because TSH goes to the thyroid and releases another hormone. T3 and T4 increase your metabolism. It's a physiological effect. So what do we call this type of hormone? Non-tropic. Let's see if you, before we go on, let's see if you remember what a negative feedback loop does. So let's say that my T3 and T4, what did I just tell you it does? It increases your metabolism, right? So it makes you warmer as a physical symptom. If this is a negative feedback loop and the final product is increasing your body temperature, what could have been an initial stimulus to start this whole thing? A drop in body temperature. You may have low body temperature, you might be feeling cold, you start releasing this chemical from the hypothalamus. It goes to the anterior pituitary and releases a chemical. That goes to the thyroid gland and releases a chemical, and that final chemical, the final hormone, causes your metabolism to go up. If it's a negative feedback loop, now that your body's hotter, what's going to happen to this loop? It shuts off. Get used to drawing or figuring out loops like that because everything about hormones revolves around those loops. Okay, I'm going to just look at my notes because that screen's so dark you can barely even read it. We're on page 131, right? 130. We're still on 130. Okay, so other points of interest, and these are definitely worth stars. This is where it gets a little bit tricky because some of these little points of interest overlap with each other. Like the first one endocrine gland may produce multiple hormones. One good example we're going to talk about actually in lab this week is pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary releases 6 hormones you're going to have to know. It's one gland releasing 6 different hormones. Even the posterior pituitary releases 2 hormones you'll have to know. You already know one of those. Anybody know what I'm talking about that we talked about last week and the week before? ADH, yeah. So the posterior pituitary releases ADH, but there's another hormone we'll talk about. The adrenal gland's the same way. We're going to talk about 4 hormones that come from the adrenal gland. So one gland can actually release multiple hormones. Right? Second one hormone may be produced by more than one endocrine gland. Anybody remember somatostatin? What did I tell you you want to think about with somatostatin? Stops everything. Anytime you see it, it's going to be a what? An excitatory hormone or an inhibitory hormone? Inhibitory. It'll actually shut things off. We've already talked about it being released in the GI tract. Now, later, we're going to talk about it being released from the hypothalamus. Same hormone released from 2 totally different places. One from the GI tract and one from the head. The third one hormone may have more than one target tissue and more than one type of effect. We talked about, well, ADH was the perfect example. ADH had 2 names. What was the other name? Vasopressin, because remember cardiologists were studying what it did to blood vessels, and they said, oh, increases blood vessel pressure, so it's vasopressin. But the urologists studied it at the same time and said, no, it works on the kidney and the distal tubule and causes you to do what with water? Retain water. Two totally different effects, but they're exactly the same hormone. So one hormone can have more than one target tissue. And ADH vasopressins are like a perfect example. Insulin's another one we'll talk about. Insulin has lots of target tissues. Next, one target tissue may be influenced by more than one type of hormone. That was a tough one to understand because when you think of a cell, we think of cells, and usually the pictures show a cell with one receptor on it. That's totally not even accurate. These little cells can have hundreds of thousands of receptors around them. And they don't all have to be the same receptor. They can be different types of receptors. Like typical somatic cells, just typical body cells like your muscle cells, they can have tons of receptors. They have receptors for insulin. They have receptors for testosterone. They have receptors for epinephrine. This one cell can have lots and lots of receptors on it, so lots of different effects by different hormones. I just gave you the example of muscle stimulated by testosterone, epinephrine, insulin. Liver is the same way. The liver can be affected by insulin, can be affected by glucagon, which we haven't talked about yet. Glucagon is just the opposite of insulin. One of those chemicals turns the liver up and makes it release lots of sugars. The other one turns it down and makes it store lots of sugars. Totally different effects, same organ. Where are we on? Letter E. Same chemical messenger may be either a hormone or a neurotransmitter. What was the example I already gave you? Yeah, epinephrine. Epinephrine's a good example. So it's released from neurons as a neurotransmitter. If it's released as a hormone, where's it released from typically? What gland would you guess would release adrenaline? The adrenal gland, exactly. Okay. And then letter F, some organs have exclusive endocrine function, whereas others have endocrine and non-endocrine. 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, we talked about the pancreas. We said the pancreas had endocrine functions, but it also had exocrine functions. When it's exocrine, where's it pushing it to? Outside the body. Where was it outside the body? Into the GI tract, right. If it's endocrine, it's dumping it into the blood. Can you think of one hormone that I said we'd get back to that's released by the pancreas? Insulin, yeah. So those little islets of Langerhans that you learn about in anatomy, those are the endocrine cells. In the pancreas, they dump things into the blood. And then 2 weeks ago, we talked about the acinar cells. The acinar cells, remember, dump enzymes into the pancreatic duct and then down into the duodenum. Other glands are exclusive. Since almost all the organs are endocrine, it's easier just to remember the ones that are exclusive. So the thyroid gland, all it does is release hormones. That's its whole job. It doesn't have any other purpose. Is the heart exclusively endocrine? What's the heart's main purpose? Pumping blood. I mean, most people don't even realize it's an endocrine gland. Something we have to point out. So the parathyroid, the thyroid, the pituitary, and the adrenal glands. How many pituitary glands do you have? 2 halves of it, right? You have the posterior and the anterior pituitary. So it's one gland split in half. And then the adrenal glands, and we'll talk about those. So 4 of them you have to memorize. And then here's the little diagram from your book. But you can see the heart's on there. The heart released, what was the name of that? AMP, atrial natriuretic peptide. What did it do? Caused you to natriuretic. Lose salt. It acts like a diuretic, but it's for Na+, remember? So it caused you to kick out salt. The stomach, we talked about histamine being released from the stomach. If it's dumped into the blood, it's a hormone. We talked about gastrin. We've talked about insulin just briefly, and we'll talk about it again. So we'll talk about all these organs. And then the ones in purple, of course, what do you already know about it? They're exclusively endocrine. Their whole purpose is just release hormones. And the pineal gland is kind of the iffy one because we know it releases hormones, but it has some other mysterious functions. So we're not sure just how broad its purposes are. Back in the olden days when they were first studying the brain, They thought the pineal gland was actually the connection where the soul was held onto the body. So if you lost your pineal gland or had a stroke, your soul floated away. All right, so which one of the following is not exclusively endocrine? Yeah, the hypothalamus. So pituitary, the adrenal, the thyroid, and what was the other one? Parathyroid, right. Good job. Okay, so now we're on to G. Overall function of the endocrine system. Of course, you already know it's going to regulate metabolism and water. What was the name of the hormone I told you already that's going to regulate metabolism? Thyroid hormone. Yep, so T3 and T4. How about water? What hormone regulated water? ADH. Yep, ADH or vasopressin. And then electrolyte balances. What's an electrolyte? What would be a good example? Sodium. Yep, sodium. So you want to think of things like aldosterone, AMP. All right, next one, inducing adaptive change to help the body cope with stressful situations. You want to write cortisol down. Cortisol is going to be the stress hormone. There are other hormones that revolve around stress. When you get stressed out, you release things like adrenaline. You know that because you get anxious, you get agitated. But cortisol is known as the stress hormone because it helps you deal with stress. I have those days when my body's just not making enough cortisol. Number 3, promoting growth and development. Growth hormone would be a good example. What would be another hormone that I've already mentioned today that helps you with growing muscle mass? So growth, testosterone. What would be the equivalent in the females? Estrogen. So they help regulate your growth. Things like what you probably wouldn't think about is bone. So testosterone increases bone growth, but it also stops bone growth, and we'll talk about that in better detail when we get to it. Number 4, controlling reproductive function. And of course you want to think testosterone and estrogen, but there's more than that. There's oxytocin, there's prolactin, which some of you have probably heard of before. How many people here have heard of oxytocin before? It's amazing how much press it's been getting in the last couple of years. How about prolactin? You must be OBGYN fanatics. So. And number 5, regulating red blood. Oh, what's this one? Erythropoietin. So we're back to erythropoietin again. Regulating red blood cell production. Where's erythropoietin made? The kidney. Why? Because of low blood. Not the cells themselves. What are the cells carrying that's low? Oxygen. It's low oxygen. So it's low blood oxygen. And then of course that erythropoietin goes to where? The bone marrow, and cause you to make more red blood cells. The red blood cells start picking up more oxygen and tell the kidney to do what? Stop. What kind of feedback loop? Negative feedback loop. And then number 6, along with the autonomic nervous system, controlling and integrating both circulation and digestion and absorption of food. So the last 2 weeks we talked, or I guess it's been a little over 2 weeks, we talked about chemicals like secretin, gastrin, cholecystokinin. What was the abbreviation for cholecystokinin? CCK. So there are a lot of functions. All right, and in my notes I put a line underneath that because those are some general principles you really want to be familiar with. Next we're going to go into the classification, which you have to memorize. So these 3 are keys for classifying. Every time we talk about a hormone from now on, you're going to have to be able to classify as one of these 3 groups. So it's either going to be peptide protein, and you already know this, when you eat proteins, what do you break them down into? Amino acids. So when you build something that's going to be a protein, what are you building it out of? Amino acids. Amino acids are like little tiny Legos. You start putting them together and you build this large structure, which is a protein. So if you want to build this large transmitter, which is a hormone, if you're building it out of amino acids, you're building it up into this large protein. It's an amino acid. Amino acids have a tendency to like water. So what do they not like? They don't like lipids and fats, right? So amino acids have a tendency to like water. Let's see how much you remember from the first couple weeks. If it likes water, is it easily going to move into a cell? No. Because why? The cell membrane is made out of phospholipids. Yep. So peptide proteins, they're made out of amino acids. They're hydrophilic, which literally means water loving. Yep, when you have a philia, you have a love for something. What if you're afraid of something? What do they call it? A phobia. So what's hydrophobic mean then? Afraid of water. All right. The next thing about these peptide proteins, when they're built, they're actually built with safety functions. They're kind of like when we talked about the proteolytic enzymes, where they start as a proenzyme or then ogen. These things start as long proteins, so they can be stored easily inside of a cell. And the storage form this large structure. When you go to release them, you have to cleave them down into a smaller structure and a smaller structure. So think of it as a grenade with two pins again. These things are made as something called a pre-pro hormone. Anytime in medicine you see something that's pre or pro, it means before. And this isn't a stutter. Pre-pro means before. That means it's the grenade with two pins in it. So if I want to start activating, I pull the first pin, I just cleave off that beginning, so I just get rid of one of the pre's. So now it's just a pro hormone. Is it active yet? Nope, it still says pro at the beginning of it, so it's not active. It's before the normal hormone. So then I have to cleave it a second time. Cleave just means breaking a piece off. And I turn it into this active hormone, and now I can do something with it. So pre-pro, then pro, and then the final active hormone. So they start as huge proteins, and then they cleaved a little bit more, and then cleaved again. And I don't know what happened here, but this is supposed to be blown up. This is just an example of how insulin works. So insulin starts as a pre-pro hormone. It starts as this long chain that you can see over here. So when it's made by the cell, you have this long curled up chain. It's inactive right now, pre-pro. So they call it pre-pro insulin. When you go to move it into its storage form inside the cell, then it becomes pro-insulin. So the only thing that's different is they cleaved off that little pre part. Now it's still inactive, but it's a little bit smaller. When you release it into your blood, then it's activated. You cleave this long chain off, and now it's the active form, which we call insulin. So it's a three-step process of making this thing active. Anybody remember where you make proteins in the cell? That's been, what, 11 weeks? 12 weeks ago? You make them in the... What part of the endoplasmic reticulum? The rough. Yep, the ribosomes on the rough endoplasmic reticulum. So if you were to look at a pathway like this, it's kind of a neat little drawing, but here you have the nucleus. The nucleus has the code for the insulin. You make it at the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Where do you package it at? The Golgi. So it moves over to the Golgi apparatus. Here it's pre-pro insulin. When it gets over to the Golgi, then it's turned into pro-insulin. And now it's stored in these little vesicles until you're exposed to what chemical that'll make you want to release insulin. You don't have to memorize this whole chart. What chemical in your body makes you release insulin? Exposure to sugar in your blood, right. So when you're exposed to sugar in the blood, then bloop, you pop that insulin out into your bloodstream as an active form. So this is the easy way to look at it. This is a little bit more complex. And then how it works is like that. So we're going to go ahead and memorize this, commit this to memory. This is actually the crap that we had to memorize when I was in grad school. Who's ever going to use that? Really. But it's a really complex process. The reason I like to show this is because, well, number one, here's the receptor. When you've triggered the receptor, it's like a massive chain of dominoes. I used to love when I was a kid looking at those chains of dominoes that happen. Every one of your cells work like that on the inside. It's this chain reaction. If you're missing any one piece of this, what disease will it cause? Yep, if you're missing any of the pieces of this chain, it causes diabetes. So it's pretty complex. So when I said who really memorizes this? People that research diabetes. So it's a chain reaction. It flips all these switches on. You can see the pathway going all over the place. And the final effect is that it pumps, or puts a little pump for sugar up on the surface of the cell. And then the cell starts sucking sugar in. So this is the kind of mess that we had to memorize. Here's what you'll have to know. Yay! So, yeah, you have the receptor for insulin. It's specific to insulin. Insulin binds to it. It turns on that chain reaction and puts a little pump up for sugar. And we'll talk about these little pumps later when we get to the insulin. So that's how simple it is. All right, whoops. Let's go back. And then that's peptides and proteins. So remember, insulin's a good example of a peptide protein. Starts as a pre-pro, gets cleaved down to a pro, and then finally gets cleaved down to an active version. All right, second type is called an amine. Amine is very specific. It's made from an amino acid, but one specific amino acid, and that's tyrosine. So it doesn't get built up into a big protein. It's tyrosine that gets bent just a little bit. When it's bent just a little bit, now it's considered an amine hormone. So the big difference between A and B is that A is a long chain of amino acids, B is one bent amino acid. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. There are two classes of amines. There's one class that's hydrophobic and one class that's hydrophilic. So the thyroid hormones, when you tweak this tyrosine and turn it into a thyroid hormone, it's a hydrophobic hormone. What's that tell you? It hates water. Is it easily going to move through the blood? Why? No, it's not. Why? What's the blood primarily? Red blood cells and water. Right, the plasma is 90% water. So anything that's hydrophobic is not going to like traveling through the plasma easily. Catecholamines, when you look at this, they're hydrophilic, which means they love water. The catecholamines you need to know, we've already talked about before, they're dopamine, norepinephrine, and what seems to go hand in hand with norepinephrine? Epinephrine, yep. So the catecholamines are dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Right. So half of the amines are hydrophobic, half are hydrophilic, and that's going to be the tough thing for you to remember. You just have to remember that if it comes from the thyroid and it's made from tyrosine, it's a hydrophobic hormone. And then the last group, the steroids. So steroids are all made from cholesterol. What do you already know about cholesterol? Is it going to love water or hate water? It's going to hate it because it falls into what kind of chemical? Proteins, carbs, or fats? It's fat. It's a lipid. So these steroids, every one of the steroid hormones are made out of cholesterol. They love lipids, which means they hate water. They hate it. Are they going to easily move through the blood? Nope. So one of the principles you can look at is if it's hydrophobic, is it easily going to move through the blood? No. So do you think it's going to have a fast reaction and get through your body quickly? Nope. So when you see hydrophobic, you want to think it takes a while to get through the body, has a slow effect. You can think of it that way. The other thing you want to think about is with hydrophobic, I always consider these the kids that can't swim. So if they can't swim, what do the kids that can't swim do? Do they jump out into the middle of the water? They stick to the sides, exactly. They cling to the sides. So these steroid hormones are going to cling to the side. When they're traveling through the blood, they're going to try and stay towards the walls unless, what makes the kids that can't swim brave to go out in the middle if they have a what? A floaty, right? So anything that's hydrophobic, for it to travel easily through your blood, it has to have a floaty device. It has to bind something that loves water, it grabs a hold of it, everything it has, and travels through your body that way. So these chemicals, when we talk about being hydrophobic, they need to have some kind of a protein carrier. When we talked about blood and we talked about the plasma, I mentioned protein carriers for things like hydrophobic hormones. So when we talk about these different hormones that are hydrophobic, I'll mention the carriers too. So there's some general principles you want to remember. Number one is the class. Does it fall into a peptide, an amine, or a steroid? The second thing you want to remember is, does it like water or does it not like water? And the third thing is, how does it travel through the body? If it's hydrophobic, it has to be bound to a floaty, right? I like that word, so I'm saying it that way. Right, so here's the example from your book on cholesterols. So cholesterol looks like this. When you bend it into a steroid, here are two examples of steroid hormones. What's the difference between these two? And don't say color. Because they're not really pink and blue. The difference is this one teeny tiny little H, the smallest element on the periodic table. That's what makes you different, feminine versus masculine. Little hydrogen, that's it. When we make a cholesterol, this is the process. And we're going to talk about all of these chemicals. You're not going to have to memorize the biochemical pathways, but in general, what you want to know or understand is that cholesterol is the starting raw material to make hormones. So is it a good idea to go on a cholesterol-free diet? No, you need cholesterol. You just don't need a ton of it. I remember hearing about this guy that went on a beer diet for a month and he got really, really sick. He had no fats, no proteins in his diet. It was basically just carbs. Maybe he went on that Miller 55 or whatever it is, 55. But with cholesterol, when you take the cholesterol in, you can bend it, manipulate it, turn it into other things like bile that we talked about before, but you can turn it into hormones, like progesterone. Who do we usually associate that with, men or women? Women. So men have a process where we make progesterone, but we want to get it converted to something else really quick, so we turn it into aldosterone. Have you ever heard of that? What's aldosterone do? Makes you retain sodium. Yep. Okay. Or we can manipulate it and turn it into that chemical cortisol. What did I already tell you about cortisol? It's the stress hormone, so it helps deal with stress. Or we can manipulate it a little bit more and turn it into testosterone, giving us more masculine characteristics. Men and women both can make this stuff called DHEA, dehydroepiandrosterone, which you're not going to have to memorize that full name. You'll remember DHEA, and that's good enough for me. But this DHEA, men and women both make it. It's actually a masculinizing hormone. With women, it gives women sex drive. Some women need more. And actually, later in life, when they're making less estrogen, this is interesting, when they make less estrogen, this becomes more powerful. So what happens to their sex drive later in life? It goes up, but what also happens to their feminine characteristics? They go down. What happens to their masculine characteristics? They go up. Yeah, so around what time in life does estrogen drop? During menopause. And then you start seeing more of the characteristics like the little mustache across the top and masculizing characteristics. A little bit more dense muscle or bone and muscle. All right. So let's see how much you paid attention to. I'm asking for the class of steroid. So if a hormone is 52 amino acids long, water soluble, stored in the secretory cell as a pre-pro hormone, what class of hormone is it? I shouldn't even have to go past the first line. What is it? It's a protein peptide. Yeah. 52 amino acids long is a giveaway. All right. You should remember that they're water soluble. By saying water soluble, does that mean it had to be a protein peptide? Nope. It could have been an amine. Yep. So it could have been the catecholamines. Right. And then it's stored as a pre-pro hormone. That definitely tells you it was a peptide also. I don't know who that 5% was. Okay, next major category. So transport, how you move them. And I already talked about this a little bit and told you you're going to have to absolutely positively memorize it. But if it's water soluble, what do we call it? If it easily dissolves in water, which means it must, like it must be hydrophilic. Yep. So if it's a water soluble hormone, it easily dissolves in the plasma, which means is it going to move easily through the blood or not? It moves very easily through the blood. So it dissolves in the plasma, moves easily, and it's called hydrophilic. The other word you want to just become synonymous with hydrophilic is lipo what? Phobic. Yep. If it loves water, it must feel what about lipids? Hate them. So if it's hydrophilic, it has to be lipophobic. And next, is it lipid soluble? If it's lipid soluble, I already told you it has to be bound to that little floaty, and the floaties are made out of proteins. So if it's lipid soluble, it must be lipophilic. It must love lipids, which means it does what for water? Hydrophobic. Right. When we refer to a hormone as being active, we mean it's in its free form. It's not bound to anything. When hydrophilic hormones circulate through your body, they circulate in an active form. They're already ready to do business. Are they moving easily through the blood? Hydrophilic? Yes, they are. So would you expect them to work quickly or slowly? Quickly. If it's active already and it loves moving through the plasma, it's going to be extremely active and it's going to work quickly. So usually if you know of a hormone that works really fast, it must be hydrophilic. It must love water. Like the steroid hormones, are they going to move fast? Nope, they're fat. They love fat. They have to be what to get through the blood? Carried. They have to be bound to something. So in other words, they're in this little floaty device in your blood, and then they have to work their way to the side. When they find the side, they have to let go of their floaty device and grab a hold of the side and move into the cell. It's not a fast process. So if you hear about a hormone that takes a long time to work, it must be water-loving or water-hating? Water-hating. What about epinephrine? Do you think it works fast or slowly? Fast. In that situation, I said, I pulled my car to the side of the road, and within 10 or 15 seconds, how do you feel? Shaky and jittery. It works really quick, so it must be what? Water-loving or water-hating? Hydrophilic. It must be water-loving. Cortisol, the stress hormone, It takes literally hours to kick in, potentially days. If you take a cortisol, in the cream form is called prednisone, or hydrocortisone. What do you put that on? Like a rash. You get a rash, you rub it on. Does it miraculously go away in minutes? How about hours? It usually takes days for it to start working. So do you think that cortisol is going to be hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Hydrophobic. It takes a long time to kick in. So those are some principles you want to make sure you're paying attention to. While we're on the hydrophilic, hydrophobic, where they work on the cell is the next thing you want to think about. If it's hydrophilic, it's water loving. Is it easily going to get inside of a cell? No. So where it works is always on the outside of a cell. So this is what your book shows. Here you have this little lipid membrane. Here you have a hormone floating along. If it's a water-loving hormone, can it get inside the cell? Nope. So it binds to its lock on the outside. It binds out here and it has a chain reaction. What was the example I gave you earlier? We had that chain of dominoes, chain reaction. Insulin. Insulin's a really good example. Insulin binds to a receptor on the surface because it's water-loving. It can't get inside the cell. What was insulin? Steroid, amine, or protein peptide? Protein peptide. It's large and it's water-loving, which means it has to bind on the outside. So hydrophilic peptides and catecholamines, they bind at the receptor on a membrane, not inside the cell. This term is, when you see second messenger system, this is that domino effect. It means it turns something on inside the cell. All of these second messengers are already made. They're sitting inside the cell just waiting for something to turn them on. They're sitting there primed. It's like dominoes that somebody spent a day setting up. They're sitting there waiting for somebody to just click the first one. As soon as you click the first one, took a day to set them up, but how long does it take to knock them down? It's like seconds, right? It's the same thing with these second messengers. They've been prepped. They took time to prep. Now they're just ready. You trip the receptor and bink. They give you that physiological effect. So second messengers are like dominoes on the inside of a cell. Right? And then typically what they'll do is they'll open some kind of adjacent channel. So that chain reaction usually does something in a distant part of the cell. If insulin binds to the surface of the cell, insulin, all it does is bind to the receptor. It turns on this chain reaction. Anybody know what a Rube Goldberg experiment is? If you ever watched I watched the Goonies last week, so it's stuck in my head. But the Goonies, when Chunk did the truffle shuffle, you gotta watch it if you haven't seen it. But he does this, and they flip a switch, and it sends a bowling ball down along the fence line that drops into a basket that causes a water hose to turn on, and the water hose slowly fills up a bucket that opens up the gate. It's not like this easy one mechanism where they open the gate. It had this long chain reaction. That's what peptides and catecholamines do. They usually open up something in the distant part by flipping a switch over here. Insulin flips a switch here, sends all those dominoes through the cell, and eventually pops a pump up on the other side of the cell. Right, and then the second one, hydrophobic steroids, and then the thyroid hormone. The thyroid hormone, remember that was an amine, but it was a hydrophobic amine. These actually go inside the cell. These are hydrophobic. Do they like the lipids or do they hate lipids? They love lipids. What's the membrane of the cell made out of? Lipids. So it can easily slide right through. And this is an example of a hydrophobic or lipophilic, which are the same thing. It slides right through the lipid membrane, goes cruising on in, gets into the nucleus, binds to the DNA, or binds to a receptor by the DNA, activates the DNA, turns on the DNA, makes a copy of the DNA, which is RNA, takes that RNA, brings it out into the cytoplasm. From the cytoplasm, then it makes a brand new protein. Is this a fast process? I'm exaggerating the steps in the whole process here for a reason. It's not quick. Remember cortisol? Cortisol takes days potentially to work. It's the same thing because it has to go in, trigger this chain reaction that finally gives us a result. When I was learning this, when I was in grad school and had to memorize all this stuff and how everything worked, I went to a burger place like 3 times a week. I love hamburgers. Not quick, fast food. So when I was studying this, I went, hey, this is just like hamburgers. If I want something good, What do? Pull up to the fast food window or go in? I go in. These steroid hormones always do something really, really powerful for you. They go into the restaurant, they sit down, they have a seat, they tell the waiter what to do. The waiter goes into the kitchen, makes something from scratch. These steroid hormones always make something from scratch. They cook it for me, they prep it, they bring it out to me, and then I eat. Long process. For a good burger, you wait 15, 20 minutes, and then you sit there and enjoy it for another half hour. What about McDonald's? You pull up to the drive-up window, right? What do you know about that burger? It was sitting, yeah, it's gross. That's totally right. It was sitting in there. Who knows how long it's been sitting in there, right? But the beautiful thing is that you pull up to this window, you order, you pull right next door, and poof, there it is, right? It was already made inside. These water-loving hormones are just like that. The water-loving hormones pull up to the first window, they tell the cell what to do, the cell already has everything ready, and then it's released. Is that a fast or a slow process? Fast. Anything that likes to bind to the outside membrane is like pulling up to the drive-through window. You get fast results. Okay, next principle, onset and duration of hormone response. Hormones can take seconds to minutes to hours or actually potentially years before they get their full effect. And I'm thinking years because how old are you when you go through puberty? 11 or 13 roughly, right? So 11 to 13 years old. For years, these hormones have been slowly building up in your system and slowly doing their effects in your system. So it could take years. And then, 50 years of age, everything starts going the other way. But the onset and duration of the response can take from seconds, minutes, to potentially years. And another thing is once the hormone turns on that reaction can't be stopped at that point. The reaction is going to go through completion, and it can take a long time to shut it off. In general, though, if it's hydrophobic, does it turn on quickly or slowly? Slowly. It loves fat, right? So it has to go all the way to the center of the cell, and it has to make something from scratch. So if it takes a long time to turn on, do you think it's going to turn off really quick? No. It takes a long time to turn it off. If it's hydrophilic, it pulls up to the drive-through window, turns on a receptor, and what do you know? Quick response, right? If it turns on quickly, what do you probably know about the effects? It's going to turn off really quickly too. Like adrenaline. You pull up to the, you get an adrenaline rush, get this quick response, 10, 15 seconds, and then 15 or 20 minutes later, you're feeling okay again. Cortisol, you rub the stuff on today, it starts slowly kicking in, and then it takes several days to go back off. And the letter D, the hormones usually amplify at the target cell. Again, think of the domino effect. It's like a snowballing effect. You flip that one domino and it causes this chain reaction, a huge response. A little bit goes a long way is kind of what you want to think there. So, in medical terms, they a lot of times call it cascade or an amplified effect. It's a chain reaction. Right. So let's see what you've caught. The hormone travels in the blood, bound to a protein, binds the receptors on the DNA, and is made from tyrosine. What hormone is it? So the first part, the hormone travels through the blood, bound to a protein. What's it tell you right away? It must be hydrophobic. It has to be hydrophobic. So if you remember, which ones can you eliminate already? The ones that are hydrophilic, right? Which of these are hydrophilic? Number 1 and number 2. So remember, this was the amine. You can cross that one out and cross the peptides out because that's the long protein chain. So it has to be either steroid or thyroid. So it binds receptors on the DNA. Does that narrow it down? That's still telling us that it's hydrophobic. So we don't know. All we know is it's hydrophobic still. How about the last one? It's made from tyrosine. It's got to be thyroid because steroids are made from cholesterol. Yep. So make sure you walk through each of the pieces. That was a tough one. All right. So hormones' availability to bind to its receptors. I don't know if I brought my phone. Hey, we have a clock again. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. I did a double take. I was just so used to it being gone. All right, so hormones available to bind to its receptors. Okay. The first property that determines whether it's available to bind is how much you release. Hopefully this is kind of a common sense thing. If you release a little bit, you get a little bit of effect. If you release a lot of it, you get a lot of bit of effect, right? So it's how fast you dump the stuff out. If I'm constantly cranking this stuff out, let's say I have a tumor, and I'm constantly releasing adrenaline, how am I going to feel? I'm going to feel on edge all the time, right? If I'm cranking this stuff out all the time, I'm always going to feel wired. Second is this rate of activation. Remember, some things take a little time to activate. It's a process. So how easily I activate these things. Like some hormones have to travel to different parts of the body. Remember when we were talking about angiotensin? When it's angiotensin 1 converted to angiotensin 2, where does it have to go? It has to go all the way up to the lungs, right? So it goes up to the lungs to that ACE and gets activated. Was that the only step of activation? No. You had to have renin binding angiotensin, OGin. You had to have angiotensin 1 going to the lungs, and then angiotensin 2 starts activating all its other products. So if it's something that takes a long chain to activate, it's going to take a long while to kick in. Next is kind of an important one, how fast you remove it from the body. Things that love water are going to travel faster through the body. So what two organs do you think are going to be responsible for cleaning these things up? Kidneys and the liver. Yep. So the more trips it goes through the kidneys and the liver, what do you think is going to happen to its rate of being shut off or broken apart? Slower or faster? Faster. It's just a numbers game. The more times you go through the kidney and the liver, the greater the odds of getting destroyed. So if it's hydrophilic, it loves water, it gets shut off a lot faster. It's metabolically inactivated faster. Remember, hydrophobic, they travel slowly, so it's going to take a long time for them to get through the blood. And that means fewer trips to the liver and the kidney. Right. And then the next one, extent of its binding to plasma proteins. Which type of hormone binds to plasma proteins? Hydrophilic or hydrophobic? The phobics. Yep. And I kind of already told you that. If it's hydrophobic, it takes longer to shut off. Hydrophilic is faster to shut off. It's the same principle as with drugs, too. If you take a drug that's lipophobic, what's that telling you? Travel easily through the blood or not? Travels easily. So what's it tell you about its ability to be inactivated? Quickly, exactly. Who's going to have a problem clearing that kind of drug, though? Somebody with kidney or liver dysfunction, right. So when you start learning these principles or rules, like I said, when you get into pharmacology, it's going to make pharmacology a little bit easier. Okay. And we just kind of walk through this. So hormones bound to plasma proteins, they take a while to get shut off. Those free ones, the ones that love water, they're going to get shut off faster. They're going to bind to target cells faster. They're going to metabolize faster. Processed overall faster. Okay. Next big concept, you have to know these. So negative feedback loops, and what's the opposite? Positive feedback loop. Okay, so primary function of hormones to regulate the various homeostatic activities. And then we've talked about this before. What page are we on in the notes, though? 133. All right, so I'm just going to show you right away the different types of feedback loops. You have that big empty page that's right across in your notes. So when you draw these, there are 4 types of loops you have to know. And I'm just going to use, actually, I'm going to pick kind of a fun one. What's this represent? An organ. Most of the loops you're going to have to know start with this organ. Can everybody read that? Let's see. So hypothalamus. What's the arrow represent? The blood. Most of the hormones released by the hypothalamus, most, are going to go to the pituitary. In fact, I'm going to be more specific. I'm going to say the anterior pituitary. From the anterior pituitary, it's going to release something and it's going to go to a target. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is like I said, I'm going to give you an example here. GnRH, which in the lab today or tomorrow or Thursday you're going to know exactly what that means. It means gonadotropin releasing hormone. But listen to that word, gonadotropin releasing hormone. What do you think the final target is going to be? Gonadotropin. Well, tropic means nurturing, right? So part of it's going to be the gonads are going to get nurtured. But first it's going to go to the anterior pituitary. So it's going to release something here. The anterior pituitary is going to release something called FSH and another chemical called LH. These are called the gonadotropins. So what are they going to do? They're gonadotropic. What's tropic mean? Nurturing. What's it going to nurture? The gonad. So in a man, what's this going to be? Yep. Testis. Women have the same ones too, but I'm using men for an example. So with FSH and LH, FSH is going to come down. FSH is going to help him produce sperm. LH is going to help him produce another hormone called, take a guess what the hormone made in the testis is? Testosterone. I'm just going to put test. All right. So with these loops, usually the stimuli, if the final factor here is to increase testosterone and increase sperm production, what probably started this off?
Low testosterone.
Yep, low testosterone, or, yep, so low TST, low sperm. Right. So when this final loop comes all the way down here, it goes to the testosterone, which is way down in the lower part of his body, in the lower part of the abdomen, is going to come through the circulation. Remember the arrows mean blood. If this turned on this pathway, what's this high testosterone going to do? Yep, turns it off. That's what the little negative signs are. A plus means it excites something. The negative means it inhibits or shuts something off. So now I have this effect. When we learned about this the very first week, what was the example, the analogy I told you to remember?
Thermostat.
Thermostat, exactly. So this would be just like the thermostat in your house. What turns on the thermostat? Low temperature. Excites the thermostat. Does the thermostat actually make the heat? Nope. It sends a little wire down into your basement and turns on a furnace. So here's where I get the fire. You hear that goosh. After this furnace gets hot enough, what happens? It turns on a fan. The fan distributes the heat. Heat comes all the way through my house, all the way back up here to the beginning, and does what to my thermostat? Shuts it off. This is an example of a long loop negative feedback, or long loop negative, or a long negative feedback loop. It's long. It goes all the way from one extreme of the body all the way up to the brain. Where's the hypothalamus at? Where's the anterior pituitary at? Also in the brain. This LH and FSH, how do they get down to the testicle? To the blood. So when they go into the blood, they're also going to come right back up. What could they do to the hypothalamus? Shut it off. This is called a short loop. I always remember short loop means that it never left the brain. This is out in the periphery. This is all the way down in the lower abdomen. This is in the brain. This hormone goes from the periphery all the way up into the brain and shuts off this loop. That's a long loop. This one comes from the brain to the brain. It's a pretty short distance. There's one more loop. It's called ultra short. This GnRH can come out and go right back up to the hypothalamus. It came from the hypothalamus, but it can also go back to the hypothalamus. That's ultra short, or uber short. All three of these are negative feedback loops. So you have an initial stimuli that releases something, and all three of these are going to do what? Reverse that, shut it off. The only other loop you need to know is just the opposite of a negative. That would be a positive. This you don't see much in men. Typically when we talk about it, you're going to see it in women in two situations. One is menstruation, and the other one's childbirth. Yep. So this would be really rare, because in this situation, if testosterone had a positive feedback loop, what would testosterone do to the hypothalamus? Turn it up. It'd turn it up higher. They'd release more testosterone. Turning it up higher, releasing more. What would happen to this guy? Right? He'd be so muscular he wouldn't be able to move. Real bad acne and a real bad attitude, too. Okay. So you need to know those four different types of loops, the three negatives and the one positive. This is why these loops and knowing how to work these loops are important, because when you get into like deeper medicine, anything endocrine related revolves around these loops. If you go to a doctor and they look at the different chemicals that are released, so they may do a test. If this person has low sperm count, they may do a test to see what's his LH and FSH look like. And if these two are low, what could be wrong with this guy? His pituitary could be broken. Is that the only thing that could be broken?
No.
Nope. His hypothalamus could be broken. If he's making way too much sperm and too much testosterone, what could be happening? It could be the testis has something wrong with it, like a tumor that's causing overproduction. So if they tested for LH and FSH and there was a tumor in the testis that's making lots of testosterone, based on a negative feedback loop, what should be happening to the LH and FSH in that person's body? Should it be high or should it be low? They're making lots of testosterone.
It should be low.
It should be low. So if a doctor takes a blood sample and they see low LH and low FSH but high testosterone, where do they know the problem's at? They know it's in the testis. Exactly. You'll see this when we'll talk about the same kind of loop when we talk about the thyroid. When somebody goes in to get the thyroid checked, they look for the chemicals that are coming from the anterior pituitary. They look for the chemicals that are coming from the thyroid, and they try and determine what's broken. Here's another fun example. Let's say somebody takes artificial testosterone. So they're a muscle head and, like I said, big muscular bad attitude. They've been taking high levels. They're taking like 500% testosterone. What's their hypothalamus going to think? Holy crap, shut off, right? So what's going to happen to the anterior pituitary? It's not going to get any signal here, right? So what's it going to do? Nothing. It does nothing. So the anterior pituitary shuts off. They're not making LH and FSH. If they're not making LH that makes testosterone, what else are they not making? They're not making FSH that develops sperm. So what's one thing you can count on is they're going to have fertility problems, right? They're going to have either infertile or low fertility. The other thing is that there's nothing happening in the testis anymore. So what happens to an organ or a part of your body you don't use? Right? So the next time you see that person with real bad acne, bad attitude, and muscle bound, you can look down and just think, I know a secret.
So
But
is that reversed, like if they stop taking all...
If they stop taking it, what's going to happen? By the way, these are steroid hormones. Do they work quickly or slowly? Slowly. Which means if they atrophy this thing and they stop taking the artificial testosterone, is their body going to kick in right away? No. Nope. So what could happen to them? Right when they first go off of it, they're going to be really low in masculizing hormones and unfortunately higher in feminizing hormones, right? So they may start crying a lot. Kind of emotional. They might start actually getting something called gynecomastia, which means a little bit of breast tissue developing. Yeah. So he was buff at one time, and now he's ready to lactate. And he's going for the chocolate cake like you wouldn't believe. But this is the way your book puts it together with this flowchart, and it's the same idea. Your book just uses a lot of boxes. Where I try and make it simple, I put a box around the organs, and then I just put the hormones next to the arrow because the arrows represent the blood flow. So usually you're going to see this pathway, hypothalamus to the pituitary to the target organ. And that's where you're going. And then remember, the negative feedback loop can come from this target organ up to the hypothalamus. It can come from the pituitary to the hypothalamus, or it can come from the hypothalamus to hypothalamus. So it's kind of a circular effect. Right. And then that positive feedback loop. Negative feedback loop technically is that one stimulus, when it starts a chain reaction, the final effect is to reverse the initial stimulus. So traditionally we think if a stimulus turns up the pathway, the final stimulus will do what to it? Turn it down. But the opposite can be true too. If the initial stimulus turns off a pathway, what could the final effect do? Turn it back on. And that's still considered a negative feedback loop. A positive feedback loop is that you enhance the initial stimulus. So if the initial stimulus was that you were too cold, and then you start turning on this pathway that makes you cooler, what's going to eventually happen to you? Your body temperature would plummet down to nothing. What about if it were your initial stimulus was you were hot and it turned on the pathway to turn on more heat? What's going to happen to you? You make more heat, it turns up the pathway. You make more heat, turns up the pathway higher. You make more heat, turns the pathway higher. Eventually you're going to cook. What is that? That would be spontaneous combustion, right? But when would you see a loop like that? When somebody's running a fever where it just keeps going higher and higher. Right? So it's similar to that pathway. Like I said, with childbirth, that's an extreme situation. There was a chemical from the brain called oxytocin that causes uterine contractions. Those uterine contractions send a signal to the brain that says release oxytocin, which causes uterine contraction. The whole time they keep releasing this oxytocin, the level of oxytocin in their blood goes higher and higher and higher. What's going to happen to their contractions? More and more frequent and more powerful every time. Right? So those are a couple types of loops. Here are some exceptions to the rule. So positive and negative. You can also have something called neuroendocrine reflex. Stress is a good example of that. You have a neural response that triggers the release of a hormone. It's not a feedback loop. It's you think things. It's a psychological effect that causes you to release a hormone. It's neuroendocrine. It's the nervous system controlling the endocrine system. And that next one, diurnal or circadian rhythms. Diurnal means day-night. Circadian means within a 24-hour period. Do those always sync up with each other? No. If you go to Alaska, you can have, what is it, 30 days of night or 30 days of day. But diurnal means day-night, circadian means 24-hour rhythm. So we'll talk about some chemicals that when you fall asleep, they're high when you fall asleep or low when you fall asleep, and then it reverses as the night progresses. Anybody know what the name of that chemical is that comes out later at night to make you sleep? Melatonin. Yep. And then early in the morning while you're sleeping, your cortisol levels rise and rise and rise, so when you get up in the morning, you're ready to deal with a stressful environment. So when's the best time to take a test? In the morning. When's the best time to have a disagreement with your mate? Early in the morning, because at night, that's when most breakups happen, right? You're like, screw it, my cortisol level's high or low, you can go to hell, and that's it. We're done. You just don't feel like it. You don't feel like dealing with stress because your cortisol is low, and then you just say, forget it. Right? So it can stages of sleep can do it. Growth hormone is going to be one of those. So the more you sleep, the more growth hormone you release. Shaquille O'Neal was asked why he thought he grew so big, and he said, because I took a lot of naps. I got a lot of sleep. He was kind of right, but I don't think he realized why. Okay, seasonal variation, things like seasonal affective disorder. They're relating to chemicals like serotonin and also the melatonin. Can be stages of development, like puberty, can have effect on that. These are all things that are not feedback loops. And then just a function of time. Right, so here's just an example from your book. This is cortisol. So here we see noon and here we see midnight. Here we see daylight, here we see nighttime. When's cortisol highest? In the morning when you wake up, right? Early in the morning, you have this peak of cortisol, and then cortisol keeps dropping. By lunchtime, you're about half your level of cortisol. By the time you go to bed at night, your cortisol is really, really low. You're just ready to crash. You get up in the morning, you're ready to start a new day. You can think of evolution. You wake up in the morning, you're going to have to start hunting for food or trying to deal with not starving to death. So here's just an example of neuroendocrine. Like I said, stress Stress is a psychological factor. It's not stress like I push on you and that causes stress. It's more like you're stressed because you're worried about things, psychology, or your psychological factors that stimulate the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus starts that chain reaction. It releases something called CRH. CRH goes to the anterior pituitary, releases ACTH, goes down to the adrenal cortex and releases that magical cortisol. And then if you want to think of it as a feedback loop, kind of, cortisol does what to stress? Helps you eliminate stress. So once you've eliminated stress, what's going to happen to this whole thing? It's going to slow down, calm down, right? And we'll talk about this whole pathway in detail when we get to cortisol. Right now, remember, we're just talking about themes and major concepts. Right? And then hormone metabolism. So once you make the hormone, you have to get rid of the hormone. Hormone metabolism means you need to break it apart. These principles also apply to drugs. So whether you're talking about a hormone or you're talking about a drug, one way to shut it off is to destroy it at the tissue. Like insulin. Insulin binds to the target cell pulls the insulin inside and chops it up, so it can't be reused. So metabolic destruction by the tissue can pull it inside and destroy it, chew it up, shred it up, break it up, do something with it so you can't reuse it. Kind of like when we talked about acetylcholine back in neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine is released, it's chopped up by that acetylcholinesterase, or cholinesterase, and then when it breaks it apart, you can't reuse it. Same thing with hormones. You break that insulin apart, it's a one-time shot. What organ makes insulin? The pancreas. So to get more insulin out, the pancreas has to make more. And that's why when people have pancreatic problems, insulin is usually one of the first things they have a problem with. Right? And then next, the liver is the most common site for metabolic inactivation, but some hormones can be metabolized by the kidneys. So when we're talking about metabolism, I'm pointing specifically at breaking them down, but it can also talk about activating. What was a hormone that I told you was activated or metabolized by the liver and the kidney to become active? Vitamin D, exactly. So you can think of the liver and the kidney as your main metabolic centers for hormone processing, whether it's activating them or inactivating them. Same thing with drugs. You know, people take a drug like aspirin, it goes to the liver, and the liver is responsible for breaking it down. If they take too much aspirin, what happens? What organs usually hit first? The liver. What's the second organ? The kidney. Yeah, so people that overdose on aspirin, usually it's the liver and the kidney start shutting down. They're overwhelmed. They're trying to break up this drug, process this drug, or metabolize it, and it's hurting them. Right? And then the hydrophilic hormones, which means they're water loving, are more easily inactivated. And I told you why. Because they travel through the organs faster. It's a numbers game. If you send a hormone through the liver 10 times, it's going to have a better chance or a faster rate of getting inactivated than a fat-loving hormone that travels through it once in an hour. So hydrophilic are activated more easily. Hydrophobics, not so easily. Right. And when the liver and the kidney process it, the liver, of course, pushes it into the bile and then pushes it out into the GI tract. And the kidney processes it and pushes it into the urine. Okay, endocrine disorders, two major classes. So we'll talk about lots of different endocrine disorders, and the last case studies you'll do are all endocrine disorders. But when you're looking at the two major classes, you have hypo and hyper. What's hypo mean? Too little. Hyper means too much. So if you're hyposecreting, that means you're not making enough. You're going to see whatever this hormone is, whatever it does, you're going to see a decrease in that final effect. Hypersecretion, you're going to see an increase in the effect. So let's just pick on thyroid hormone again. Thyroid's like the perfect one because I'm sure everybody here has heard of hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. If I told you thyroid did what? What was the one thing I've told you so far thyroid hormone does? Affects metabolism. It increases metabolism. If you hypersecrete thyroid hormone, then what's it going to do? Increases your metabolism. It raises your metabolism. What physical characteristics is somebody with hyperthyroidism going to have? Skinny, right? They're going to be skinny. What about their body temperature? Typically high. They have what we refer to as heat intolerance. You put them in a warm room and they're like, ugh, they're sweating. They get real bitchy about it too. So, which is another thing with thyroid. Thyroid affects your brain. It affects your blood pressure. What's going to happen to their blood pressure? It increases their blood pressure. Their anxiety goes up. They're really impatient type of people. People with hyperthyroidism are usually jittery, They're fidgety, they're skinny, they're heat intolerant. That's what happens when you hypersecrete. You get a massive effect of thyroid. What about those people that are hyposecreting? If thyroid is responsible for raising metabolism and you have less thyroid hormone, what's going to happen to your metabolism? It lowers. What's going to happen to the physical characteristics of that person? Heavier set, right? So they can eat less food and they still manage to put on weight. What about their body temperature? It's lower. So how do they usually feel? Cold, yeah. How about their moods? Lowers. What psychological characteristic usually comes with hypothyroidism? Depression. Now, so if you know what the hormone does, and I say it's a hypersecretion disorder, you just take that hormone and turn it up. And all the physical symptoms the hormone gave you are now increased or enhanced because of hypersecretion. Hyposecretion, just the opposite. Those are the two major categories. When we classify as primary and secondary, primary, almost every disorder I've ever seen, if they call it primary, it means that the organ that is doing the work is broken. So if thyroid hormone is being hyposecreted, what organ's broken? The thyroid. If it's secondary, it means anything but that organ. So thyroid hormone is controlled by the anterior pituitary. Secondary hyposecretion could be because the anterior pituitary is broken. The thyroid's healthy and fine, it's just not getting the proper signal. Since the anterior pituitary is controlled by the hypothalamus, maybe the hypothalamus is broken. If the hypothalamus doesn't tell the anterior pituitary to do anything, the anterior pituitary can't tell the thyroid. Thyroid's healthy, anterior pituitary is healthy, but they still have hyposecretion. It's secondary. Anything but the main organ is considered secondary. It's the same thing when you talk about other disorders like hypertension. If it's primary hypertension, what's the problem? What's hypertension mean? High blood vessel pressure, right? So if it's primary, what's the problem? There's something wrong with the blood vessels. If it's secondary, it means it's something else. It could be the kidneys. If the kidneys are retaining too much water, what's going to happen to your blood pressure? Goes up. That's hypertension, right? But would it be primary or secondary? Secondary, because it's not the blood vessels that are affected. That's just one of those, nobody ever told me that in school, but I've noticed with every disease when I'm teaching pathophysiology, if they say it's primary, it's always the organ of interest. It's the main organ. Same things with this. Anytime you see a disease that's related to endocrine, if they call it primary hypo, that means it's the organ that's under secreting. If they call it primary hyper, it means it's the organ that's hypersecreting or oversecreting. All right. So let's see. Hyposecretion, some causes. Cancer is a major one. Cancer destroys things. If a cancer gets into that organ and destroys the tissue, what's going to happen to its productivity? It has to go down. With hypersecretion, just the opposite, a tumor. Does a tumor have to be cancer? No. A cancer is a type of tumor. Tumors rapidly grow. They rapidly are active. They're rapidly producing things. Typically, and I'm not saying always, but typically hypersecretion is caused by a tumor. Hyposecretion is caused by a cancer. I said typically, not always. Okay. Another cause of hyposecretion, a lot of times, is autoimmune. What's that mean?
Body attacking.
The body's attacking that organ. We saw myasthenia gravis in lab last month. Myasthenia gravis, it's autoimmune. The body's attacking the little receptors for acetylcholine. It's going to turn down activity. Radiation will do this. Hyposecrete. Radiation likes to stop things from working. Chemotherapy does the same thing. Chemotherapy has a tendency to turn things down. Those are all causes of hyposecretion. Am I forgetting any? Iatrogenic. I-A-T-R-O-G-E-N-I-C. It's I-A-T-R-O. Iatrogenic. It's pronounced iatrogenic. Anybody know what that means? The doctor done it, right? The doctor did it. It's the doctor's fault. Does that mean that there's a lawsuit impending? No. Sometimes the doctor has to take something out to save somebody's life. If they take out part of the person's thyroid, what's going to happen? Hyper or hyposecrete? Hyposecrete. It's going to decrease their production. How about idiopathic?
Unknown.
Idiopathic, the beginning is I-D-I-O. It's one letter away from feeling like an idiot, right? So idiopathic means I always feel like an idiot because I don't know the pathology. It's unknown. Idiopathic means unknown causes. Those are typically the causes of hyposecretion. And then the tumors cause hypersecretion typically. Some drugs can cause hypersecretion. So those are your two main categories. Okay. The little secondary is if it's not the organ or the release of the hormone, it might be how the hormone works. Like diabetes. Diabetes are two types, right? There's type 1, which means the pancreas is broken. The pancreas is not releasing what chemical? Insulin. There's also type 2, which means the pancreas is usually releasing insulin, but what's not happening? What's the insulin have to find? A receptor. It has to find a receptor at the target cell. So any of those steps of the target cell can be broken. Either they don't have the receptors, so maybe it's missing the receptor. If there's no lock, the key's worthless. You can put tons of keys, tons of insulin in your blood, but if you have no receptors for it, it does nothing for you. Okay. It could be those second messengers. Maybe the dominoes aren't in place. Maybe there's something wrong with the dominoes. Lots of receptors, so you're spinning the key, but the lock's broken. There's nothing inside the lock that's working. And these last two are kind of important, especially when you're talking about drugs again, but down and up regulation. When you down-regulate something, if you're a cell and you're constantly being bombarded with insulin, what are you eventually going to want to do? Get more excited by insulin? You say, screw it. I'm tired of insulin. I'm not going to put any more receptors up for insulin. It's down-regulating its receptor number. So is it going to be more sensitive or less sensitive?
Less sensitive.
Less sensitive. It's called desensitizing. Down-regulating is desensitizing. There are some forms of type 2 diabetes that are down-regulation of those receptors. My stepdad was a type 2 diabetic, and he was in a really bad accident and broke his neck in 6 places. Wish it were one more. It's not my stepdad anymore. But so he broke his neck in several places, and he was suspended in the hospital for like 8 weeks. And during that time, he was put on a really strict diet. And when he left, he was 70 pounds lighter, and he also wasn't a type 2 diabetic anymore. That says that something was happening in his body. He was abusing his cells, and they were saying, screw this. You're putting too much sugar in here. We're not going to take it anymore, and they down-regulated. He was desensitized to sugar or insulin. Up-regulation means that it starts cranking out more receptors. So is it going to be more or less sensitive? More. I always think of when I was in college and coffee. Man, I drink lots of coffee. And so after several weeks of drinking lots of coffee, what would happen to me? Upregulate or downregulate? Downregulate. And then I'd stop drinking coffee, and those cells were going, hey, what happened to the coffee? Where'd the coffee go? We kind of liked it. It was too much, but we kind of liked it. So now what are they going to do? They start popping all these receptors back out, right? They're ready. So then when I drink coffee, what do you know? I've upregulated, and how do I react to the coffee? I'm extremely sensitive, exactly. So a little bit of coffee went a long way. Up and down regulation. And I know we only have like 3 minutes left, but I just want to go through these last 3 things and then we're done. So we can perfect build into the lab. So the last thing you have to know for the principles are 3 ways hormones act. So when you put 2 hormones together, there are 3 ways they can work with each other. One is they can be permissive. Permissive is when one allows another one to work. So if one allows the other one to work, if you're missing that first one, the other one can't work. It's called permissive. Thyroid's a really good example of that. Epinephrine in thyroid hormone, if you don't have thyroid hormone, epinephrine doesn't work properly. It's like 2 parts of a key. So they have to both be present in the appropriate amounts to get the right response. Growth hormone is the same way with thyroid hormone. If you don't have enough thyroid hormone, your growth hormone doesn't work properly either. So somebody that has hypothyroidism, what do you know is going to happen to their growth? Decreased growth. Yeah, somebody that's born with hypothyroidism, would you expect them to have gigantism or dwarfism? Dwarfism. Right. Next one, synergy. You ever worked really well with somebody? They say you have synergy. It means that you can do your job and they can do your job, but when you two work together, what happens? You do it way better than either person alone could do it. So some hormones work synergistically. You put them together and they just click. FSH and testosterone are those 2. When I gave you that flow chart, FSH caused you to produce Sperm. I always see FSH and it looks like fish and I think sperm. So FSH causes sperm. FSH will make you make sperm if you're a man. Had to put a little disclaimer on there, but it'll make you produce sperm. But if you have testosterone, you add it to it, what's that tell you about your sperm production? Dramatically increases. So a man needs testosterone to get proper sperm production, but without the testosterone, you can still make some sperm. It's a synergistic effect. And then the last one's antagonist. What's that mean? They work against each other. One will actually shut off another, and this is an interesting one. Estrogen and progesterone. Usually when you're thinking about pregnancy, what happens to the woman's blood levels of estrogen and progesterone? They both go up. They both go up. But what's interesting about progesterone is progesterone actually shuts off estrogen from working. So estrogen, when it binds to the uterus, it causes uterine contractions. What progesterone does is that when a baby's in there, progesterone comes along, it sticks to the receptors before estrogen and blocks them so that what doesn't happen? She doesn't contract the uterus and do what with the baby? Expel the baby. So progesterone actually blocks the effects of estrogen. That's an antagonistic effect. That's it. Look at that. 2:31. So 1 extra minute.